The Adventure of the Norwood Builder. From the point of view of the criminal expert, said Mr. Sherlock Holmes, London has become a singularly uninteresting city since the death of the late lamented Professor Moriarty. I can hardly think that you would find many decent citizens to agree with you, I answered. Well, I must not be selfish, said he with a smile as he pushed back his chair from the breakfast table. The community is certainly the gainer, and not one the loser. Save for a poor out-of-work specialist, whose occupation is gone. With a man in the field, one's morning paper presented infinite possibilities. Often it was his smallest trace, Watson, the faintest indication, and yet it was enough to tell me that the great malignant brain was there, and the greatest tremors from the edges of the web reminded one of the foul spider which lurks in the center. Petty theft, wanton assault, purposeless outrage. The man who held the clue on all the world, one connected whole. To the scientific student of the higher criminal world, no capital in Europe offered the advantages which London then possessed. But now, he shrugged his shoulders in humorous deprecation of the state of things, which he had himself done so much to produce. At the time of which I speak, Holmes had been back for some months, and I, at his request, had sold my practice to return to share the old quarters of Baker Street. A young doctor named Werner had purchased my small Kensington practice, and given with astonishingly little demur the highest price that I ventured to ask, an incident which he only explained himself some years later when I found that Werner was a distant relation of Holmes's, and that it was my friend who had really found the money. Our months of partnership had not been uneventful, as he had stated, for I find on looking over my notes that this period includes the case of the papers of the ex-president Murillo, and also the shocking affair of the Dutch steamship Friesland, which so nearly cost us both of our lives. His cold and proud nature was always averse, however, to anything in the shape of public applause, and he bound me in the most stringent terms to say no further word of himself, his methods, or his success, a prohibition which, as I have explained, has only now been removed. Mr. Sherlock Holmes was leaning back in his chair after his whimsical protest, and was unfolding his morning paper in a leisurely fashion, when our attention was arrested by the tremendous ring at the bell, followed immediately by a hollow drumming sound, as if someone was beating at the outer door with his fist. As it opened, there came a tumultuous rush into the hall, rapid feet clattering up the stair, and an instant later a wild-eyed and frantic young man, pale, disheveled, and palpitating, burst into the room. He looked from one to the other of us, and under our gaze of inquiry he became conscious that some apology was needed for his unceremonious entry. I'm sorry, Mr. Holmes, he cried. You mustn't blame me. I'm nearly mad. Mr. Holmes, I'm the unhappy John Hector MacFarlane. He made the announcement as if his name alone would explain both his visits and his manner. But I could only see by my companion's unresponsive face that it meant no more to him than to me. Have a cigarette, Mr. MacFarlane, said he, pushing his case across. I'm sure that with your symptoms my friend Dr. Watson would prescribe a sedative. The weather has been so very warm these last few days. Now, if you feel a little more composed, I should be glad if you would sit down in that chair and tell us, very slowly and quietly, who you are and what it is you want. You mentioned your name, as if I should recognize it, but I assure you that, beyond the obvious facts that you are a bachelor, a solicitor, and a Freemason, and an asthmatic, I know nothing whatsoever about you. Familiar as I was with my friend's methods, it was not difficult for me to follow his deductions, and to observe the untidiness of his attire, the sheaf of legal papers, the watch charm, and the breathing which had prohibited him. Our client, however, stared in amazement. "Yes, I'm all that, Mr. Holmes. And in addition, I'm the most unfortunate man at the moment in London. For heaven's sake, don't abandon me, Mr. Holmes. If they come to arrest me before I've finished my story, make them give me the time so that I can tell you the whole truth. I could go home to the gaol happy if I knew that you were working for me outside." "Arrest you?" said Holmes. "This is really most interesting. On what charge do you expect to be arrested for?" "Oh, upon the charge of murdering Mr. Jonas Aldacre of Lower Norwood." My companion's expressive face showed a sympathy which was not, I'm afraid, entirely unmixed with satisfaction. "Dear me," he said. "It was only this moment at breakfast that I was saying to my friend, Dr. Watson, the sensational cases had disappeared out of our papers." A visitor stretched forward a quivering hand and picked up the Daily Telegraph, which still lay upon Holmes's knee. "If you'd looked at it, sir, you'd have seen at a glance what the errand is on which I have come to you this morning. I feel as if my name and my misfortune must be in every man's mouth." He turned it over to expose the central page. "Here it is, and with your permission, I'll read it to you. Listen to this, Mr. Holmes. The headlines are, 'Mysterious Affair at Lower Norwood. Disappearance of a well-known builder. Suspicion of murder and arson. A clue to the criminal.' That is a clue which they are already following, Mr. Holmes. And I know that leads infallibly to me. I've been followed from London Bridge Station, and I'm sure that they are only waiting for me with a warrant to arrest me. It will break my mother's heart. It will break her heart." He wrung his hands in an agony of apprehension and swayed backwards and forwards in his chair. I looked at interest upon this man who was accused of being the perpetrator of a crime of violence. He was flaxen-haired and handsome in a washed-out, negative fashion, with frightened blue eyes and a clean-shaven face, with a weak, sensitive mouth. His age may have been about 27. His dress and bearing were that of a gentleman. From the pocket of his light summer overcoat produced the bundle of endorsed papers which he proclaimed his profession. "We must use what time we have," said Holmes. "Watson, would you have the kindness to take the paper out and read me the paragraph in question?" Underneath the vigorous headlines which our client had quoted, I read the following suggestive narrative. Late last night and early morning, an incident occurred at Lower Norwood which points, it is feared, at a serious crime. Mr. Jonas Aldacre is a well-known resident of that suburb, where he has carried his old business as a builder for many years. Mr. Aldacre is a bachelor, 52 years of age, and lives in Deep Den House, at the Sydenham end of the road of that name. He has the reputation of being a man of eccentric habits, secretive and retiring. For some years he has practically withdrawn from his business, to which he is said to have amassed considerable wealth. A small timber yard still exists, however, at the back of his house, and last night, about 12 o'clock, an alarm was given that one of the stacks was on fire. The engines were soon upon the spot, but the dry wood burned with a great fury, and it was impossible to arrest the conflagration until the stack had been entirely consumed. Up to this point, the incident before the appearance of an ordinary accident, but fresh indications seemed to point to a serious crime. Surprise was expressed at the absence of the master of the establishment from the scene of the fire, and an inquiry followed which showed that he had disappeared from the house. An examination of his room revealed that the bed had not been slept in, that a safe which stood in it was open, that a number of important papers were scattered about the room, and finally, that there were signs of a murderous struggle. Slight traces of blood being found within the room, and an oaken walking stick, which also showed stains of blood upon the handle. It is shown that Mr. Jonas Oldacre had received a late visitor in his bedroom upon that night. The sick found has been identified as the property of this person, who was a young London solicitor named John Hector McFarlane, junior partner at Graham and McFarlane, 426 Gresham Buildings, E.C. The police believe that they have evidence in their possession which supplies a very convincing motive for the crime, and altogether it cannot be doubted that the sensational developments will follow. Later, it is rumored that we go to press that Mr. John Hector McFarlane has actually been arrested on the charge of murder of Mr. Jonas Oldacre. It is at least that a warrant has been issued. There have been further and sinister developments in the investigation in Norwood. Besides the signs of a struggle in the room of the unfortunate builder, it is now known that the French windows of his bedroom, which is on the ground floor, were found to be open, that there were marks of some bulky object had been dragged through the woodpile, and finally it is asserted that the charred remains have been found among the charcoal ashes of the fire. The police theory is that the most sensational crime has been committed, that the victim was clubbed to death in his own room, his papers rifled, and his dead body dragged across the wood stack, which was then ignited as to hide all traces of the crime. The conduct of the criminal investigation has been left in the experienced hands of Inspector Lestrade of Scotland Yard, who is following up the clues with his accustomed energy and sagacity. Sherlock Holmes listened with closed eyes and fingertips together to his remarkable account. "The case has certainly some points of interest," said he in his languid fashion. "May I ask, in the first place, Mr. McFarlane, how is it that you are still at liberty, since the papers appears to be enough evidence to justify your arrest?" "I live at Torrington Lodge, Blackheath, with my parents, Mr. Holmes. But last night, having to do business very late with Mr. Jonas Oldacre, I stayed at a hotel in Norwood, and came to my business from there. I knew nothing of this affair until I was on the train when I read what you have just read. I at once saw the horrible danger of my position, and hurried to put the case into your hands. I have no doubt that I should have been arrested either at my city office or at home. A man followed me from London Bridge Station, I have no doubt. Great heavens, what is that?" It was a loud clang of the bell, followed instantly by heavy steps upon the stair. A moment later, our old friend Lestrade appeared in the doorway. Over his shoulder I caught a glimpse of one of two ununiformed police outside. "Mr. John Hector McFarlane," said Lestrade. Our unfortunate client rose with a ghastly face. "I arrest you for the wilful murder of Mr. Jonas Oldacre of Lower Norwood." McFarlane turned to us with a gesture of despair and sank into his chair once more, like one who is crushed. "One moment, Lestrade," said Holmes. "Half an hour more or less can make no difference to you, and the gentleman was about to give us an account of this very interesting affair, which might aid us to clearing it up." "I think there will be no difficulty in clearing it up," said Lestrade grimly. "Nonetheless, with your permission, I should much be interested to hear his account." "Well, Mr. Holmes, it is difficult for me to refuse you anything, for you have been used to the force once or twice in the past, and we owe you a good turn at Scotland Yard," said Lestrade. "At the same time, I must remain with my prisoner, and I am bound to warn him that anything he say may and will be used in evidence against him." "I wish nothing better," said our client. "All I ask you is you should hear and recognize the absolute truth." Lestrade looked at his watch. "I'll give you half an hour," said he. "I must explain first," said McFarlane, "that I knew nothing of Mr. Jonas Oldacre. His name was familiar to me, for many years ago my parents were acquainted with him, but they drifted apart. I was very much surprised, therefore, when yesterday, about 3 o'clock in the afternoon, he walked into my office in the city. But I was still more astonished when he told me the object of his visit. He had in his hand several sheets of notebook, covered in scribbling writing. Here they are, and he laid them upon my table. Here's my will, he said. I want you, McFarlane, to cast it into the proper legal shape. I will sit here while you do so. I set myself to copy it, and you can imagine my astonishment when I found that, with some reservations, he had left all of his property to me. He was a little strange ferret-like man, with wide eyelashes, and when I looked up at him I found his keen gray eyes fixed upon me with an amused expression. I could hardly believe my own senses when I read the terms of the will, but he explained that he was a bachelor with hardly any living relations, and that he had known my parents in his youth, and that he had always heard me a very deserving young man, and assured me that his money would be in worthy hands. Of course, I could only stammer out my thanks, and this will duly finished, signed, and witnessed by my clerk. This is on the blue paper, and these slips, as I've explained, are a rough draft. Mr. Jonas Oldacre then informed me that there was a number of documents, building leases, title deeds, mortgages, script, and so forth, which is necessary that I should see to understand. He said that his mind would not be easy until the whole thing was settled, and he begged me to come out to his house at Norwood that night, bring the will with me, and to arrange all the matters. Remember, my boy, not a word to your parents about the affair until everything is settled. We will keep it a little surprise for them. He was very insistent upon it at this point, and made me promise it faithfully. You can imagine, Mr. Holmes, that I was not in the humor to refuse him anything that he might ask. He was my benefactor, and all my desire was to carry out his wishes in that very particular order. I sent a telegram home, therefore, to say that I had important business on hand, and that it was impossible for me to say how late I might be. Mr. Oldacre had told me that he would like me to have supper with him at 9, as he might not be home before that hour. I had some difficulty in finding his house, however, and it was nearly half past before I reached it. I found him. "One moment," said Holmes. "Who opened the door?" "A middle-aged woman who was, I suppose, his housekeeper?" "And it was she, I presume, who mentioned your name?" "Exactly," said McFarlane. "Pray proceed." McFarlane wiped his damp brow, and then continued his narrative. "I was shown by this woman into a sitting room where a frugal supper was laid out. Afterwards, Mr. Jonas Oldacre led me into his bedroom, in which there stood the heavy safe. He opened and took out a mass of documents, which we went over together. It was between 11 and 12 when he finished. I remarked that we must not disturb the housekeeper. He showed me out through his own French window, which had been open all the time. "Was the blind down?" asked Holmes. "I will not be sure. I believe that it was only half down." "Yes, I remember how he pulled it up in order to swing open the window. I could not find my stick, and he said, 'Never mind, my boy, I shall see a good deal of you tomorrow. I hope, and I will keep your stick until you come back to claim it.' I left him there, the safe open, and the papers made up in packets on the table. It was so late that I could not get back to Blackheath, so I spent the night at the Annerley Arms. I knew nothing more until I read of this horrible affair in the morning." "Anything more you would like to ask, Mr. Holmes?" said Lestrade, whose eyebrows had gone up once or twice during the remarkable explanation. "Not until I have been to Blackheath." "You mean to Norwood?" said Lestrade. "Oh, yes, no doubt, that is what I must have meant," said Holmes with his enigmatic smile. Lestrade had learned by more experiences than he could care to acknowledge that the resolute brain could cut through that which was impenetrable to him. "I think I should like to have a word with you in private, Mr. Holmes," said he. "Now, Mr. McFarlane, 2 of my constables are at the door, and there is a 4-wheeler waiting." The wretched young man arose, and with his last beseeching glance at us, he walked out from the room. The officers conducted him to the cab, but Lestrade remained. Holmes had picked up the pages which formed a rough draft of the will, and was looking at them with the keenest interest upon his face. "There are some points about this documents, Lestrade, are there not?" he said, pushing them over. The official looked at them with a puzzled expression. "I can read the first few lines, and these are in the middle of the second page and at 1 or 2 at the end. Those are as clear as the print," said he, "but the writing between is very bad, and there are all 3 places where I cannot read it at all." "What do you make of that?" said Holmes. "Well, what do you make of it?" "That it was written in a train. Good writing represents stations, the bad writing represents movement, and the very bad writing, passing over points. A scientific expert would pronounce at once that this line was drawn up in a suburban line, since nowhere save in the immediate vicinity of a great city would there be so quick a succession of points. Granting that this whole journey was occupied by drawing up the will, then the train was an express, only stopping once between Norwood and London Bridge." Lestrade began to laugh. "You are too many for me when you begin to get on your theories, Mr. Holmes," said he. "How does this bear on the case?" "Well, it corroborates the young man's story to the extent that the will was drawn up by Jonas Oldacre in his journey yesterday. It is curious, is it not, that a man should draw up so important a document in a haphazard fashion. I suggest that he do not think it was going to be much of a practical importance. If a man drew up a will which he did not intend over to be effective, he might do so." "Well, he drew up his own death warrant at the same time," said Lestrade. "Oh, you think so? Don't you?" "Well, it was quite impossible, but the case is not clear to me yet." "Not clear? Well, if it isn't clear, what could be clear? Here's a young man who learns suddenly that if a certain older man dies, he will succeed in a fortune. What does he do? He says nothing to anyone, but he arranges that he shall go out on some pretext to see his client that night. He waits until the only other person in the house is in bed, and then in the solitude of the man's room he murders him, burns his body in the woodpile, and departs to a neighboring hotel. Blood stains in the room and also on the stick are very slight, so it's probable that he imagined this crime to be bloodless, and hoped that if the body were consumed it would hide all traces as the method of his death. Traces which for some reason must be pointed to him. Is this not all obvious?" "It strikes me, my good Lestrade, as being just a trifle too obvious," said Holmes. "You do not add imagination to your other great qualities. But if you could, for your moment, put yourself in the place of this young man, would you choose the very night after the will had been made to commit your crime? Would it not seem dangerous to you to make so close a relation between the 2 incidents? Again, would you choose an occasion when you are known to be in the house, when a servant has let you in? And finally, would you take the great pains to conceal the body and yet leave your own stick as a sign that you were the criminal? Confess, Lestrade, that is very unlikely." "As to the stick, Mr. Holmes, you know as well as I do that a criminal is often flurried and does things that a cool man would avoid. He was very likely afraid to go back to the room. Give me another theory that would fit the facts." "I could easily give you half a dozen," said Holmes. "Here, for example, is a very possible and even probable one. I make you a free present of it. The older man is showing documents which are of evident value. A passing tramp sees them through the window, the blind of which is only half down. Exits the solicitor, enter the tramp. He seizes the stick, which he observes there, kills Oldacre, and departs after burning the body." "Why should a tramp burn the body?" "For the matter of that, why should McFarlane?" "To hide some evidence?" "Possibly the tramp wanted to hide that any murder had been committed." "And why did the tramp take nothing?" "Because there were papers that he could not negotiate." Lestrade shook his head, though it seemed to me that his manner was less absolutely assured than before. "Well, Mr. Sherlock Holmes, you may look for your tramp, and while you are finding him, we will hold on to your man. The future will show which is right. Just notice this point, Mr. Holmes, that so far we have known none of the papers were removed, and that the prisoner is the one man in the world who had no reason of removing them, since he is the heir at law and would come into them in any case. My friend seemed struck by this remark. I don't mean to deny that the evidence in some ways are very strongly in favor of your theory, said he. I only wish to point out that there are other theories possible. As you say, the future will decide. Good morning. I dare say that in the course of the day I shall drop by Norwood and see how you are getting on. Then the detective departed. My friend rose and made his preparations for this day's work, with an alert air of a man who has a congenial task before him. My first movement, Watson, he said, as he bustled into his frock coat, must, as I said, be in the direction of Blackheath. And not Norwood? Because we have in this case a singular incident coming close to the heels of another singular incident. The police are making the mistake of concentrating their attention on the second, because it happens to be the one which is actually criminal. But it is evident to me that the logical way to approach the case is to begin by trying to throw some light upon the first incident. The curious will, so suddenly made, and to do unexpectedly in air. It may do something to simplify what followed. Now, my dear fellow, I don't think you can help me. There is no prospect of danger, or I should not dream of stirring out without you. I trust that when I see you in the evening, I will be able to report that I have been able to do something for this unfortunate youngster who has thrown himself upon our protection. It was late in the evening when my friend returned, and I could see by a glance at his haggard, anxious face that the high hopes with which he had started out had not been fulfilled. For an hour he droned away upon his violin, endeavoring to soothe his own ruffled spirits. At last he flung down the instrument and plunged into a detailed account of his misadventure. It's all going wrong, Watson. All as wrong as it can go. I kept a bold face before Lestrade, but upon my soul I believe that for once the fellow is on the right track and we are on the wrong. All of my instincts are one way and all the facts are another, and I much fear that British juries have not yet attained the pitch of intelligence when they will give the preference to my theories over Lestrade's facts. Did you go to Blackheath? Yes, Watson. I went there and found very quickly that the late lamented Oldacre was a pretty considerable blackguard. The father was away in search of the son. The mother was at home. A little fluffy blue-eyed person with a tremor of fear and indignation. Of course, she would not admit even the possibility of his guilt, but she would not express either surprise or regret over the late fate of Oldacre. On the contrary, she spoke of him with such bitterness that she was unconsciously considerably strengthening the case for the police. For, of course, if her son had heard of her speak to this man in this fashion, it would predispose him towards hatred and violence. He was more like a malignant and cunning ape than a human being, said she, and he always was ever since he was a young man. You knew him at that time, said I. Yes, I knew him well. In fact, he was an old suitor of mine. Thank heaven that I had the sense to turn away from him and marry a better, if a poorer man. I was engaged to him, Mr. Holmes, when I heard a shocking story of how he had turned a cat loose into an aviary, and I was so horrified at his brutality and cruelty that I should have nothing more to do with him. She, rummaging into a bureau, presented a photograph of a woman shamefully defaced and mutilated by a knife. That is my own photograph, said she. He sent it to me in that state, with his curse upon my wedding morning. Yikes. Well, said I, at least he has forgiven you now, and has left you all his property to his son. Neither my son nor I want anything from old Jonas Acre. Dead or alive, she cried, with the proper spirit. If there is a God in heaven, Mr. Holmes, and that same God who has punished what wicked man will show his own good time that my son's hands are guiltless of his blood. Well, I tried 1 and 2 leads, but could get nothing which would help my hypothesis, and several points which would make against it. I gave up at last, and I went off to Norwood. This place, deep in a house, is a big modern villa of staring black, standing back from its own grounds, with a laurel-clumped lawn in front of it. To the right, and some distance back of the road, is a timber yard which has been the scene of the fire. Here's a rough plan on the leaf of my own notebook. This window on the left is the one which opens to Oldacre's room. You can look into it from the road, and you see. That is about the only bit of consolation I have had today. Lestrade has not been there, but his head constable did the honors. They had just made a great treasure trove. They had spent the morning raking among the ashes and burning woodpile, and besides the charred organic remains, they had secured several discolored metal discs. I examined them with care, and they were, no doubt, trouser buttons. I even distinguished that one from which marked the name of Holmes, who was Oldacre's tailor. Then I worked in the lawn carefully for signs and traces of draught were made, and everything from hard as iron. Nothing was to be seen save for some body or bundle had been dragged through the low privet hedge which is in the line of the woodpile. All that, of course, fits in the official theory. I crawled out about the lawn with an August sun on my back. I got up at the end of an hour no wiser than before. Well, after this fiasco, I went into the bedroom and examined that also. The bloodstains were very slight, mere smears or discolorations, but undoubtedly fresh. The stick had been removed, but there was also marks on the slate. There was no doubt about the stick belonging to our client. He admits it. Footmarks of both men could be made out of the carpet, and none of any third party, which again is the trick of the other side. They were piling up their score all the time, and were at a standstill. Only one little gleam of hope did I get, and yet it amounted to nothing. I examined the contents of the safe, most of which had been taken out and left on the table. The papers had been made up into sealed envelopes, 1 or 2 of which I had opened by the police. They were not, so far as I could judge, of any great value, nor did the bank book show that Mr. Oldacre was in such very affluent circumstances. But it seemed to me that all the papers were not there. There were allusions to some deeds, possibly more valuable, which I could not find. This, of course, if we could disprove, would turn Lestrade's argument against himself, for who would steal such a thing if he knew they would shortly inherit it? Finally, having drawn every other corner and picked up no scent, I tried my luck at the housekeeper. Mrs. Lexington is her name, a little, dark, silent person, with suspicious and sidelong eyes. She could tell something if she would, I convinced it, but she was as close as wax. Yet she had let Mrs. MacFarlane in at 9:30. She wished her hand had withered before she had done so. She had gone into bed at 10:30. Her room was at the other end of the house, so she could hear nothing of what passed. MacFarlane had left his hat, and, to the best of her belief, a stick in the hole. She had been awakened by the alarm of the fire. Her poor dear master was certainly been murdered. Had he any enemies? Well, every man had enemies, but Mr. Oldacre kept himself so much to himself, and only met people in the way of business. She had seen the buttons, and was sure that they belonged to the clothes which he had worn that night. The woodpile was very dry, for it had been several months since it had rained. It burned like tinder, and by the time she reached the spot nothing could be seen but flames. She had all the firemen smelled of burning flesh from inside it. She knew nothing of the papers, nor of Mr. Oldacre's private affairs. So, my dear Watson, there's my report of a failure, and yet... He clutched his thin hands in a paroxysm of conviction. I know it's all wrong. I feel it in my bones. There's something that has not come out, and that housekeeper knows it. There's a sort of sulky defiance in her eyes, which only goes to the guilty knowledge. However, there's no good talking about any more, Watson. But unless some unlucky chance comes our way, I fear that the Norwood disappearance case will not figure in the chronicle of our successes, which I foresee that the patient public will sooner or later have to endure.
Surely, said I, a man's appearance would go far with any jury.
That is a dangerous argument, my dear Watson. You remember what terrible murderer, Bert Stevens, who wanted us to get him off in '87? Was there ever a more mild-mannered, Sunday-school-looking man?
Oh, that is true.
Unless we succeed in establishing an alternative theory, this man is lost. You can hardly find a flaw in the case which can now be presented against him, and further investigation has served to strengthen it. By the way, there is one curious little point about those papers which may serve us as the starting point for an inquiry. On looking over a bank book, I found that the low state of the balance was principally due to large checks which have been made out during the last year to a Mr. Cornelius. I confess that I should be interested to know who this Mr. Cornelius may be, with whom a retired builder has such a large transactions. Is it possible that he has had a hand in an affair? Cornelius might be a broker, and he might have found no script correction of these large payments. Failing any other indication, my researches must now take the direction of an inquiry to the bank for the gentleman who has cashed these checks. But I fear, my dear fellow, that our case will end ingloriously by Lestrade hanging our client, which is certainly a triumph for Scotland Yard.
I do not know how far Sherlock Holmes took any sleep that night, but when I came down to breakfast I found him pale and harassed, his bright eyes the brighter for the dark shadows around them. The carpet round his chair was littered with cigarette ends and with early editions of the morning papers. An open telegram lay upon the table.
"What do you think of this, Watson?"
he asked, tossing it across. It was from Norwood, and ran as follows. Important. Fresh evidence to hand. McFarlane's guilt definitely established. Advise you to abandon case. Lestrade. This sounds serious, said I.
It is Lestrade's little cock-a-doodle of victory.
Holmes answered with a bitter smile.
And yet it may be premature to abandon the case. After all, the important fresh evidence is a two-legged thing. It may possibly cut into a very different direction to which Lestrade imagines. Take your breakfast, Watson, and we will go together to see what we can do. I feel as if I should need your company and your moral support today.
My friend had no breakfast himself, for it was one of his peculiarities that in his more intense moments he would permit himself no food, and have known him to presume upon his iron strength until he has fainted from pure inanition.
At present I cannot spare energy and nerve force for digestion,
he would say, in answer to my medical remonstrances. I was not surprised, therefore, when this morning he left his untouched meal behind him as we started with me for Norwood. A crowd of morbid sightseers were still gathered around Deep Den House, which was just such a suburban villa as I had pictured. Within the gates Lestrade met us, his face flushed with victory and his manner grossly triumphant.
"Well, Mr. Holmes, have you proved us to be wrong yet? Have you found your tramp?" he cried. "I have formed no conclusions whatsoever," my companion answered. "But we formed ours yesterday, and now it proves to be correct, and you must acknowledge that we have been a little in front of you all this time, Mr. Holmes. You certainly have the air of something unusual having occurred," said Holmes. Lestrade laughed loudly. "You don't like being beaten any more than the rest of us do," said he. "A man can't expect always to have it in his own way, can he, Dr. Watson? Step this way, if you please, gentlemen, and I think I have can convince you just once and for all that it was John McFarlane who did all these crimes. He led us through the passage and out into a dark hall beyond. This is where young McFarlane must have come out to get his hat after the crime was done, he said. Now look at this. With dramatic suddenness, he struck a match by his light and exposed a stain of blood upon the whitewashed wall. As he held the match near, I saw that it was more than a stain. It was a well-marked print of a thumb. Look at that with your magnifying glass, Mr. Holmes. Yes, I'm doing so. You're aware that no two thumbprints are alike? I've heard something like that. Oh, then, you'll please compare this print of this wax impression of young McFarlane's right thumb, taken by my orders this morning. As he held the waxen print close to the blood stain, it did not take the magnifying glass to see that the two were undoubtedly from the same thumb. It was evident to me that our unfortunate client was lost. That is final, said Lestrade. Yes, that is final, I voluntarily echoed. It is final, said Holmes. Something in his tone caught my ear, and I turned to look at him. An extraordinary change had come over his face. It was writhing the inward merriment. His two eyes were shining like stars. It seemed to me that he was making desperate efforts to restrain a convulsive attack of laughter. Dear me, he said at last. Oh, who would have thought it? And how deceptive appearances may be, to be sure. Such a nice young man to look at. It's our lessons for us not to trust our own judgment, isn't it, Lestrade? Yes, some of us are a little too much inclined to be cocksure, Mr. Holmes, said Lestrade. The man's insolence was maddening, but we could not resent it. What a professional thing that this young man should press his right thumb against the wall and taking his hat from the peg. Such very natural action, too, if you come to think of it. Holmes was outwardly calm, but his whole body gave a wiggle of suppressed excitement as he spoke. By the way, Lestrade, who made this remarkable discovery? It was the housekeeper, Mrs. Lexington, who drew the night constable's attention to it. Where might this night constable? He remained on guard in the bedroom where the crime was committed, as to see that nothing was touched. But why didn't the police see this mark yesterday? Well, we had no particular reason to make a careful examination of the hole. Besides, it's not a very prominent place, as you see. No, of course not. I suppose there is no doubt that the mark was there yesterday. Lestrade looked at Holmes as he thought he was going mad out of his mind. I confess that I myself was surprised at both his hilarious manner and his rather wild observation. I don't know whether you think that McFarlane came out to go in the dead of the night in order to strengthen the evidence against him, said Lestrade. I leave it to any experts in the world whether that is the mark of his thumb. It is unquestionably the mark of his thumb. That's enough, said Lestrade. I am a practical man, Mr. Holmes, and when I have got my evidence I come to any conclusions. If you have anything to say, you will find me writing my report in the sitting room. Holmes had recovered his equanimity, though I still seemed to detect gleams of amusement in his expression. Dear me, this is a very sad development, Watson, is it not? He said, and yet there are singular points about it which hold out some hopes of our client. Indeed, Holmes, what is it? Only this, that I know that mark was not there when I examined the hole yesterday. And now, Watson, let us have a little stroll around in the sunshine.
With a confused brain, but with a heart into some warmth of hope was returning, I accompanied my friend into a walk around the garden. Holmes took each face of the house in turn and examined it with great interest. Then he led the way inside and went over the whole building from basement to the attics. Most of the rooms were unfurnished, but none the less Holmes suspected them minutely. Finally, on the top corridor, which ran outside and untenanted bedrooms, again he was seized with a spasm of merriment. There really are some very unique features about this case, Watson, he said. I think it is time that we took our friend Lestrade into our confidence. He has had his little smile at our expense, and perhaps we may do as much by him as if my reading of this problem proves to be correct. Yes. I think I see how we should approach it. The Scotland Yard inspector was still writing in the parlor when Holmes interrupted him. I understood that you were writing a report on this case, said he. So I am. Don't you think it may be a little premature? I can't help thinking that your evidence is not complete. Lestrade knew my friend too well to disregard his words. He laid down his pen and looked curiously at him. What do you mean, Mr. Holmes? Only that there is an important witness whom you have not yet seen. Can you bruise him? I think I can. Do so. I will do my best. How many constables have you? 3 within call. Excellent, said Holmes. May I ask if they are very large, able-bodied men with powerful voices? I have no doubt that they are, though I fail to see what their voices have to do with anything. Perhaps I can help you to see and 1 or 2 things as well, said Holmes. Kindly summon your men. I will try. 5 minutes later, 3 policemen had assembled in the hall. In the outhouse you will find a considerable quantity of straw, said Holmes. I will ask you to carry it in 2 bundles of it. I think it will be of the greatest assistance in producing the witness from whom I require. Thank you very much. I believe you have some matches in your pocket, Watson. Now, Mr. Lestrade, I will ask you all to accompany me to the top landing. As I've said, there was a broad corridor there, which ran outside 3 empty bedrooms. At one end of the corridor were all marshalled by Sherlock Holmes, the constables grinning and Lestrade staring at my friend in amazement, expectation, and derision chasing each other after across his features. Holmes stood before us with the air of a conjurer who is performing a trick. Would you kindly send one of your constables for 2 buckets of water, and put the straw on the floor here, free from wall on either side. Now I think we are all ready. The sword's face has begun to grow red and angry. I don't know whether you think you're playing a game with us, Mr. Sherlock Holmes, said he. If you know anything, you can surely say it without all the tomfoolery. I assure you, my good Lestrade, that I have an excellent reason for everything I do. You may possibly remember that you have chaffed me a little some hours ago, and when the sun seemed on your side of the hedge, so you must not grudge me a little pomp and ceremony now. Might I ask you, Watson, to open that window, and then to put a match on the edge of the straw? I did so, and driven by the draught, the coil of grey smoke swirled down the corridor, while the dry straw crackled and flamed. Now we must see if we can find this witness for you, Lestrade. Might I ask you to join in the cry of fire? Now then, 1, 2, 3,
Fire! 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 We all yelled. Thank you. I'll trouble you once again. Fire! Just once more, gentlemen, and all together. Fire! The shout must have rung all over Norwood. It had hardly died away when an awakening thing happened. A door suddenly flew open out of what appeared to be a solid wall at the end of the corridor, and a little wizened man darted out like a rabbit out of its burrow. Capital, said Holmes calmly. Watson, the bucket of water with straw. That will do. Lestrade, allow me to present you with our principal missing witness, Mr. Jonas Oldacre. The detective stared at the newcomer with blank amazement. The latter was blinking in the light of the corridor and peering at us at the end of a smoldering fire. It was an odious face, crafty, vicious, malignant, with shifty light grey eyes and white eyelashes. What's this, then? Said Lestrade at last. What have you been doing all this time, eh? Oldacre gave an uneasy laugh, shrinking back from his furious red face of the angry detective. I've done you no harm. No harm? You've done your best to get an innocent man hanged. If it wasn't for this gentleman here, I'm sure that you could have not have succeeded. The wretched creature began to whimper. I'm sure, sir, it was only my practical joke. Oh, a joke, was it? You won't find the laugh on your side, I promise you. Take him down and keep him in the sitting room until I come. Mr. Holmes, he continued, when they had gone, I would not speak before the constables, but I don't mind saying, in the presence of Dr. Watson, that this is the brightest thing that you have done yet, though it is a mystery to me how you did it. You have saved an innocent man's life, and you have prevented a very grave scandal, which would have ruined my reputation in the force. Holmes smiled and clapped Lestrade upon the shoulder. Instead of being ruined, my good sir, you will find that your reputation has been enormously enhanced. Just make a few alterations to that report which you were writing, and they will understand how hard it is to throw dust out of the eyes of Inspector Lestrade. And you don't want your name on it? Not at all. I work for my own record. Perhaps I shall get the credits also some distant day when I permit this zealous historian to lay out his fool's cap once more. Eh, Watson? Well now, let us see where this rat has been lurking. A lath and plaster partition had been run across the 6 feet of the end, with a door cunningly concealed within it. It was lit within slits of the eaves. A few articles of furniture and a supply of food and water were within, together with a number of books and papers. There's an advantage of being a builder, said Holmes as we came out. He was able to fix up his own little hiding place without any confederates, save, of course, that precious housekeeper of his, whom I should lose no time in adding to your bad, Lestrade. I'll take your advice, but how did you know this place, Mr. Holmes? I made up my mind that the fellow was hiding in the house, when I paced out the corridor and found it was 6 feet shorter than the other corresponding one below. It was pretty clear where he was. I never thought he would be quite the nerve to lie quiet before an alarm of fire. We could, of course, however, gone in and taken him out, but it amused me to make him reveal himself. Besides, I owed you a little mystification, Lestrade, from your chaff in the morning. Oh, sir, you certainly got equal with me on that. But how in the world did you know that he was in the house at all? The thumb mark, Lestrade. You said it was final, and so it was in a very different sense. I knew it had not been there the day before. I pay good attention to detail in the matters, as you have often observed, and I had examined the hall and was sure that the wall was clear. Therefore it had been put on during the night. But how? Very simply. When those packets were sealed up, Mr. Jonas Oldacre got McFarlane to secure one of the seals by putting his thumb upon the soft wax. It would have done so quickly and naturally, do I say, that the young man himself has no recollection of it. Very likely it was just so happened, and Oldacre found himself in no position of use, he would put to it. Brooding over the case at the den of his, he suddenly struck him that he would absolutely damning evidence if he could make against McFarlane by using that thumb mark. It was the simplest thing in the world for him to make a wax impression from the seal, to moisten it as much blood as he could get from a pinprick, and to put a mark upon the wall during the night, either with his own hand or with that of his housekeeper. If you examine among those documents, which he took with him into his retreat, I will lay you a wager that you find the seal with a thumb mark upon it.
Wonderful, said Lestrade. Wonderful. It is clear as crystal, as you put it. But what is the object of his deep deception, Mr. Holmes? It was amusing to me to see how the detective's overbearing manner had changed suddenly to that of a child asking questions of his teacher.
Well, I don't think it's very hard to explain. A very deep, malicious, vindictive person is a gentleman who is now waiting downstairs. You know that he was once refused by McFarlane's mother. You don't. I told you that you should go to Blackheath first and Norwood afterwards. Well, this inquiry, as he would consider it, was rankled in his wicked, scheming brain all his life, as he was longed for vengeance and never seen his chance. During the last year or two, things had gone against him. Secret speculation, I think, and he finds himself in a bad way. He determines to swindle his creditors, and for the purpose he pays large checks to a certain Mr. Cornelius, who is, I imagine, himself under a different name. I have not traced these checks yet, but I have no doubts that they were banked under the name of some provincial town where Oldacre, from time to time, led a double existence. He intended to change his name altogether, draw the money, and vanish, starting his life elsewhere.
That's likely enough.
It would strike him that, in disappearing, he might throw all pursuit off his track, and at the same time have an ample and crushing revenge upon his old sweetheart, if he could give the impression that he had been murdered by her only child. It was a masterly piece of villainy, and he carried it out like a master. The idea of the will, which would give an obvious motive for the crime, the secret visit unknown by his parents, the retention of the stick, the blood, and the animal remains and buttons for the woodpile, were all very admirable. It was a net from which it seemed to me a few hours ago that there was no possible escape. But he had not the supreme gift of an artist, and knowledge of when to stop. He wished to improve that which was already perfect, to draw the rope tighter yet around the neck of the unfortunate victim, and so he ruined it all. Let us descend, Lestrade. There are just one or two questions that I would ask him.
The malignant creature was seated in his own parlor with a policeman upon each side of him. It was a joke, my good sir, a practical joke, nothing more. He whined incessantly. I assure you, sir, that I simply concealed myself in order to effect my disappearance, and I am sure that you would have not been so unjust as to imagine that I would have allowed any harm to befall the young McFarlane.
That's for a jury to decide, said Lestrade. Anyhow, we shall now have you on charge of conspiracy, if not for attempted murder. And you'll probably find that your creditor will impound the banking account of Mr. Cornelius, said Holmes.
The little man stared and turned his malignant eyes upon my friend. I have to thank you a good deal, he said. Perhaps I'll pay my debt some day.
Holmes smiled indignantly. I fancy that for some years you will find your time very fully occupied, said he. By the way, Was it you who put the woodpile beside your old trousers? A dead dog, rabbits, or what? You won't tell. Dear me, how very unkind of you. Well, I dare say that a couple of rabbits could account for both the blood and for the charred ashes. If you ever write an account, Watson, you can make rabbits serve your turn.